Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir. Welcome back to Aria of Sorrow. We're starting with just a moment of silence for my reputation as a competent gamer, which died last episode. And we'll keep going with the rest of the clock tower. So dealing with death is actually really only about halfway through the clock tower. You need to use the School of Soul, which you get from him, in order to go farther into the depths of it, which is somehow below water, despite the fact that this is really high up in the air. One of the weird aspects of this game's design. But it's kind of quirky and fun. So anyway, dealing with the Great Armor again, we're going to head back down. Fight these lightning dolls, who really are the easiest enemies in the clock tower, I'd say. They move very slowly, and their attacks are very easy to avoid. Really, they're just a distraction that makes it harder to deal with the other, more difficult enemies. And as is fairly typical of Castlevania, some of the hardest enemies to deal with here are some of the easiest, the Medusa heads. Or I should say, the ones with the least HP. Medusa heads are always very hard to deal with in almost any game. I've been replaying Symphony of the Night recently too, actually, and Medusa heads are a real pain in the ass in that game. For one thing, you tend to get knocked back a lot farther when you're hit in Symphony of the Night. But that's a story for another Let's Play if I do it, or another video. So we're just heading back down here. And I had this slight suspicion that there was something going on with that wall in the left hand. It's one of these instincts you sort of get after a while when you've played enough Metroidvanias. You know, people often say, for instance, that in Metroid you have to bomb every wall in order to find the secrets. I don't think that's true. Or you have to, bomb every square inch of floor. That's really not true. There's clues. And if you play the games long enough, you'll realize what those clues are. So here we get a new weapon, the Mistletoe, which is a pretty cool weapon. I like it a lot. It's also got a cool name. Mistletoe is the old name for mistletoe. And actually, something I learned from the Yogscast, mistletoe literally means little dung twig, because it would grow in dung. At least that's what they believed, the ancient druids. Familiar if you've, read Asterix books. I, of course, am so cool that I read the Asterix books as an adult. But, we can't all be that cool. Anyway, and here we have the devil. He's not the devil, he's a devil. There's quite a few of them in this game. But one of the more interesting, larger enemies, one of the interesting things about the devil enemy is just that he takes up so much of the room when he comes in. And later there'll be versions of that called the Archdemon that are even bigger and more difficult to deal with. An interesting idea for an enemy. They have similar enemies in Dawn of Sorrow, but they just don't tend to be as interesting in that game. Maybe because the art design of that game is a little more standardized. In this game, with the really chunky, giant sprites, the devil is really kind of a shocking enemy appearance. So here's one of my favorite rooms in the clock tower. It's just this total maze of spikes. No reason for anyone to ever build something like this. A classic illustration of the idea presented in Symphony of the Night that the castle is a creature of chaos, and so it may take on many forms, including ones that do not make a lick of sense. We get the pitch black suit in here, which is very good for the defense, but because I'd been wearing the elfin robe, it takes down my intelligence a bit. But then again, who needs intelligence? Intelligence didn't get me anywhere last episode, I'll tell you that much. And I mean that in both senses of the word. So this really is just a total side area to get the pitch black suit. It's a good suit, good defense upgrade, but I don't know that it's totally worth going through this whole area. It might be worthwhile just to skip it, especially since in an upcoming area that's just sort of a couple past this, you'll get an even better defensive item. And in fact, if you're willing to go to a special area that we're going to go to pretty soon here, you get even better armor, which makes a joke out of the entire rest of the game, defense-wise. This is another room I really like in this game. There have been similar set pieces to this in quite a few Castlevania games. I believe there's something like this in Super Castlevania 4, although I haven't played it enough to get there. And there's also definitely something like this in Harmony of Dissonance and Symphony of the Night. Anyway, by going through this little puzzle area, you get the Burt Gang, which is a pretty good sword. The Mistletoe is better. But the Burt Gang has some other upgrades to your stats, so depending on what build you're going for, the Burt Gang can be useful. Thankfully, though, with these upgrades, we are finally in a position to lay some pain down on the bomber armors. They're no longer the massive, walls that we were running into earlier. In fact, we're definitely reaching the point where the clock tower is no longer nearly as much of a threat as it used to be. And you can pretty much breeze through it at this point. One of the things I've always loved about Castlevania games is the sense you get as you go through them, that what was once a really formidable obstacle slowly goes down in difficulty until it's more of just fun to go through. But then you see new challenges that reintroduce that sense of danger. And Symphony of the Night is actually the best for that because it's so crazy with the amount of damage enemies can dish out and that you can hit them with. It manages to make that twist like 5 or 6 times. This game is not quite that, excessive. But it's still really good at making you go from feeling underpowered to feeling overpowered, and then back again. We're nearing the end of the clock tower here. And we haven't actually seen a warp room in a really long time. We're about to see the one for the clock tower, and it's a very unusual warp room, because it's not very useful. It's right at the bottom of the clock tower. And so, when you use it, in order to get to the other areas that you reach from the clock tower, you'd have to go through the whole thing again. The clock tower is actually one of the most intimidating regions in the entire game. And so the fact that you're expected to do that with this warp room is a little bit crazy. So I don't actually use this warp room very much at all. I suppose they wanted to put it there because there isn't one in the floating gardens. And they have reasons for not putting a warp room in the floating gardens, but still, I don't know, a little bit disappointing. Anyway, we're heading back to see Mina for a bit, get healed up.
Okay.
So I don't normally talk over these, but this is an optional cutscene, so I'll just say this here. When you talk to Mina, she says "Okaeri," which is Japanese for "welcome back." Literally, it's "Kaeru" is to come. And then when you leave, she says "Kiwotsukete ne," which literally means something like keep your senses awake or energized, but figuratively it means take care of yourself or just take care. I always kind of interpret it as keep your eyes open. Be aware of your surroundings. So we're going to stop by Hammer's shop again and look at some of the new stuff. Some very nice armor and weapons here. Unfortunately, we are not too flush with cash. And he finally is stocking the Soul Eater ring, which is a really cool item that unfortunately costs way more money than you were ever going to get in a single playthrough of this game. There is a New Game Plus option in this game where you get to keep the items and souls that you had from a previous playthrough while going back to level 1 in terms of experience. That is pretty much the only way you're getting the Soul Eater ring in this game. And we're not going to be showing more than one playthrough, so obviously I won't get it. But it does just substantially increase your chances of getting souls. The actual luck boost is relatively minor, so your chances of getting better items from it are not that great. But for souls, it's really good. And there are some enemies in this game with very rare souls. I'll point a few of them out when we see them. So for a minute here, I was heading back up. I think I was looking for another secret room. But I eventually decided to just sort of finish off the clock tower. I'm not sure if I remembered at the time just how little of the clock tower was left. We literally have this one room and now we're done. Like I said, past the warp room, there's almost nothing here. So here we head back down to the castle hallway. And we're going to be heading down with the School of Soul, which allows us to, travel through water, down to some of the lower levels of the castle underwater. There are actually 2 entrances to this next area. What I'm showing you here is me going down the rightmost one. We will be coming back up through the leftmost one and then back down that way, so you'll get to see both. So this was the area actually where we found the flying armor right at the beginning of the game. Now with Skula, we can actually get past it and through a doorway into the next region. Now it doesn't say Underground Waterway because we actually came to this area at the beginning of the game. It's just we couldn't do anything when we got here. But now we're finally here for good. So there's a few of these kind of Viking-looking longboats going around. And with the Flying Armor Soul, you can use them to get up to some higher levels. Which is nice. We saw a sword over there that I think I'm going to try to get. There we go. This is Milliken's sword, one of my favorite weapons in the game, actually. It has a petrifying effect and sort of a stone element. Milliken's sword is one of the less common swords that appears in the Castlevania series. I'm not sure if there's one in Symphony of the Night. I know there's one in Portrait of Ruin, which is where I first heard about it, but I'm not sure if it's in any other games besides these 2. But here we run into some interesting new enemies. We have the Nightmares, who are these sort of ghostly presences, men on horseback, who charge at you. One of the better souls of the game, offensively, actually, if you can get it. And then we also have this interesting character, the Flesh Golem. I mentioned earlier that not all of the Golem-type enemies have high defense. This guy's the exception. He is a Golem, he hits like a truck, but his defense is actually relatively poor. The reason that he's such a brick wall is because of his high HP. But he's one of the more interesting golems. I actually like him. And here's an interesting little section. We have this boat with no water going down. There is actually no way to get the water rolling. You have to ride this boat as it courses down this waterway and stay on it, which is not easy. It involves some complex movement inputs. And then you have to ride it all the way down, and then jump off of it with the flying armor right when it hits the apex of its jump. Now, if it seems to you that that was just a simple case of trying this twice and then abandoning it, don't be fooled. That was a match cut that I did in editing. I actually tried to get that thing to go 6 or 7 times, but I cut all of those others out and then just edited it to make it look like I only tried twice, because really, that's too much failure for one YouTube video. Surely I've failed enough already as it is. Anyway, this section of the Underground Waterway is kind of fun. It's the sort of half-flooded area where very little of this place, for obvious reasons, is actually above water. But in these areas, you sort of have rooms that are half-flooded. You might have noticed in there that there is a handgun, one of the more interesting weapons, but not a very useful one. We'll be getting that much later. It requires you to either have the ability to fly or to do some very fancy tricks. Oh, and I didn't manage to cut out the one more time I tried and failed to jump on that thing. Hope springs eternal, as they say. As does stupidity. And I managed to get the Nightmare Soul here. This, I didn't realize it at the time because I'd actually never used it before in a regular playthrough. But this is an incredibly useful soul, and I'm going to be sticking with it to pretty much the end of the game. Not that I use it all the time, but by the end of the game I'll have it back on. So yeah, being here, having gotten rid of the nightmares, and gotten a pretty nice lance out of it, actually, kind of demonstrates how golems are really not dangerous enemies unless there's more than one enemy in the room with them. By themselves, they're very easy to dodge, and really just not a problem. I got a nice drop of money from that one torch. Or it's not really a torch, it's a wall sconce. Should just call it a sconce. So there's a lot of imps in this room, and there's also the underwater version of the boneheads, which are called fish heads, appropriately enough. I don't know how they managed to spit fire underwater, but, miraculous things happen. This is a magical castle, after all. Just checking the map here to make sure I'm going in the right direction. This is one of the more open-ended areas in Aria of Sorrow. At almost any given location, there's multiple directions you can go in, so it has a bit of a labyrinthine quality, actually. Here we have a little tunnel full of needles. A reasonably interesting soul, but not one I'm going to use, and not one I use very much in a regular playthrough. We have another enemy in this room, which we've already fought a few of them before, but I'll talk about him here. Triton. I really like Triton. He's got a great design. That's a very elaborate sprite. Pretty fun to fight. He has a couple of different interesting attacks and a lot of HP. He can be one of the harder enemies to cut your way through in this. He also is cool from a sound design perspective because he blows his horn and it has this sort of fanfare, like a charge that he plays while he's trying to ram into you. One of the more unique enemies, actually, Triton. There aren't a lot of enemies from any other Castlevania game that are similar to that. Unlike, this kind of enemy, of which there's enemies like this in lots of different Castlevania games. But I love this type of enemy, the kind where you have to pick your moment, and right when he's about to attack, you attack him and then duck out of the way. Harmony of Dissonance is full of enemies that work like this, and in fact, in that game, that's almost just your typical way of fighting, is this sort of trading back and forth, strategy kind of fighting. But in Aria of Sorrow, the Dead Crusader is one of the few enemies that does that, and so I appreciate them. Oh, here we have a big tower of fish heads. And another one of these guys, who I do not need to fight, and yet I do anyway, just for fun. The the rhythm, sort of, the pattern of just wait for him to raise the sword, hit him, and then backdash. It's just one of the things in this game that I love to do. These guys are genuinely fun to fight. And here we reach basically the second part of the Underground Waterway. We're not going to spend much time here for now, but we'll be coming back in a bit. Which are, instead of this, what looks like a castle, we're really into caves that don't even look like they're man-made. Which is kind of funny, because it was the castle that was supposed to have been sucked into the eclipse, not all the surrounding area. But it's entirely possible that Dracula asked people to build a castle with caves in it. Because he's just that kind of guy. He's incredibly stylish. So what we're passing through here is the other possible entrance to the Underground Waterway. In fact, the first one that we entered right at the beginning of the game. Lots of killer fish here. I'm just smacking them around a little, to make up for the fact that at the beginning of the game they were smacking me around. Not so tough when I can be underwater too, now are you? No, the real reason actually I'm going up at this point is this is an easy way to get back to a save point. I was pretty low on health, and pretty low on potions, and I didn't want to risk it too much. What can I say? This particular playthrough kind of turned me into a chicken. I guess because I was a little nervous about wasting viewers' time. So we managed to save, and now we're going to head on our way back. This room, I forgot to mention, is actually really similar to the room at the very beginning of the castle entrance in Symphony of the Night. I didn't notice that a few of the times I played this game, but having just played Symphony of the Night, the resemblance is uncanny. It even has the same, like, rock construction at the top that sort of forms a tunnel. It is interesting, the extent to which different Castlevania games rip off Symphony of the Night, because Symphony of the Night was such a big game. There was so much to it, so many different regions and enemies and items, that basically it had room to be ripped off by tons of different games. And so different Castlevania games have sort of taken different facets of Symphony of the Night and run with them. Aria of Sorrow, I would say, is one of the ones that has the least obvious debt to Symphony of the Night, and yet even it has things like that room that are clearly influenced by Symphony of the Night, and maybe considered callbacks to it. Now, here's a very curious enemy, one I actually like a lot, the Man-Eater, which is a bunch of eyeball worms hiding inside the skull of some other giant creature, which you never actually get to see what that creature was like in any Castlevania game. Nice little bit of mystery. Instead, you only get to see the creature that's taken it over like a hermit crab. And the Man-Eater is genuinely spooky. It's one of the enemies in this game that I actually find kind of gruesome. Which, you know, it's supposed to be scary. That's sort of the point, right? The Man-Eater was also adapted to become a boss in Order of Ecclesia. In that game, they made him look a little more gory. But honestly, it's not any scarier. I think it's about equally scary. We also get here the Rahab's sword, which I love. Rahab later became a boss in Dawn of Sorrow, which is the sequel to this game. But Rahab's sword is basically just an ice elemental sword. I think the only one in the game that has that element. There's several swords in Symphony of the Night that have an ice element, but only this one in Aria of Sorrow, I believe, has it. I forgot to mention, I'm definitely not alone in liking the Man-Eater and thinking that maybe it should have a little more prominence than it does, because I've been watching a really good YouTuber called Jupiter Climb playing through a randomized version of this game and its levels that is made to be like a roguelike, and in it, one of the bosses that they have is actually just a Man-Eater encounter. So they've repurposed some of the regular enemies in the game to be bosses in order to extend the boss list. And that was the one they chose, which was pretty cool. So we managed to get down here and find a save point. Theoretically, I didn't need to go back up to get the save point, but I was just playing it safe. And we have some cool new enemies here. I like the Ukobaks, who are just little gremlins that go around setting fires. They're based on creatures from, I believe, German mythology that go around setting fires in caves. You know, like Nickel, or there's another word for those creatures. I think Tommyknockers might be a name for one of those in English mythology. But anyway, they're imps that are supposed to live in mines. And it's a reflection of the fact that mines are really dangerous, and that if you have a lantern, you can accidentally set an entire cave ablaze and kill yourself. So, since it's such a dangerous line of work, people have sort of established these myths about the danger, and personifying it as a kind of gremlin. Don't mind me here, I was just doing some breakdancing. Actually, I thought there must be something about that little alcove that led to a secret room or something like that, but if there is, I couldn't find it. I should also mention here a new enemy, the Cagnazzos, who I like a lot. They are based on one of the characters of the Malabranche, or Wicked Tales, which are demons from one of the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno. I had a video about my favorite Castlevania enemies once where I talked about the various creatures of the Malabranche. There are 13 of them mentioned in the Inferno, but only 6 of them ended up in Castlevania games. 3 in this game and then 3 in its sequel. One of the things I really like about both Aria and Dawn is how erudite they are. There's lots of references to demonology and like classic Greek myth and things like that. Which is not to say those things don't exist in other Castlevania games, because they do. But these games go crazy with them. And so it's something I just love. It reminds me of a TV show I watched when I was a kid called The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, which was a really goofy show about 2 kids who force the Grim Reaper to be their best friend, which, of course, as a Castlevania fan, you have to love the Grim Reaper or death in anything. But it also had all of these ridiculous, just literary and cultural references that were way too sophisticated for a show that was that silly. There's a whole episode where Billy is possessed by the spirit of the poet Lord Byron, and there are actual quotes from Lord Byron poems in the episode. And I just love that combination of high and low culture. It's actually one of my favorite things to find ways that people manage to sneak culture and edification into, silly kids' stories. So Aria of Sorrow was brilliant at that, and I give it a lot of credit for being the first. The fact is that Dawn of Sorrow is in many ways a more polished version of Aria, but it's less surprising. It has less of that element of just charm that comes from doing it for the first time, and also a bit of the charm that comes from doing it in a low-res format. This game, of course, is on the Game Boy Advance, and it has a very, crusty kind of art style. Dawn of Sorrows is much more polished and professional looking, but it's also more generic. It just looks like an anime. Anyway, back to the actual game. We have some enemies that I love in the Underground Waterway. In general, this is one of my favorite areas. The slimes are kind of interesting. I'm not a huge fan because they're annoying. They can poison you. And as mentioned before, poison in this game is a particularly annoying status ailment. Not as dangerous as poison normally is, but more annoying. We also have the Disc Armors, who are a whole load of fun. The Disc Armors also appear in Dawn of Sorrow, but they're more interesting here. In Dawn, their use is much more restricted. They're basically only in the Condemned Tower in that game. Here, you'll have noticed, they've already appeared in multiple different levels, and they use them very cleverly on sloped surfaces in order to make their discs a bit more challenging. In the Condemned Tower in Dawn of Sorrow, the Disc Armors often they're not as difficult to deal with because of the terrain that they're on. Aria was very intelligent about how it used that. Anyway, having gone down all the way, or most of the way, we're now heading back up, and we are back in the portion of the Underground Waterway, which does actually look like sewers that might be in a real building, or multiple buildings. I mean, these sewers, you can tell from the background, must be huge. These look like sewers big enough to serve an entire city. We also have in here the Une, who are a very simplistic enemy that have been in Castlevania games at least since Super Castlevania 4. Which in that game, because any enemy could deal a fair proportion of your health bar, they were very challenging to get through in that, and something you had to deal with. In this game, less so. Une always deal a tiny, piddling amount of damage. And the main thing they are is an annoyance. In this game, they can spawn more of themselves, which any game in which they can do that in Castlevania, Une are a bit more of a nuisance and kind of have to be dealt with. Now, I had thought, from my memories of playing this game before... Oh, I should mention, we're back at the T intersection that we went left at before. I had thought that the slimes in this game were not this annoying and were sort of easier to deal with, but they take a lot of hits. I'd forgotten just how robust they actually are. Slimes are, of course, an old kind of enemy in any game. There were slimes in Dragon Quest, which is one of the oldest, popular RPGs there is. There's probably something like the slime in Dungeons & Dragons, which is where it got in Dragon Quest. And then, of course, slimes have been in Castlevania games for a long, long time. Oh, dear. Yeah, this is just sad. This is a room with a single fish in it, and he can't go anywhere. I considered killing him, but really, why add insult to injury? His life is already total misery. Let him enjoy his final moments in peace, I say. You can see here the direct effects of poison. I'm doing half as much damage to this slime until it goes away. Just very irritating. To be honest, I would almost prefer the normal type of poison, where you just slowly lose HP. I guess it depends on exactly how much you'd lose. The FromSoft games have certainly taught us that poison can be a truly formidable status effect. What is not truly formidable is the return of the big golem. The, I think, third of the repurposed boss into regular enemy encounters that we've run into here. I hated the big golem when he was a boss, and he's no better here. If anything, he's probably worse, because you have to deal with him every time you go through this room. And it really never becomes interesting. He's just an impediment. One of the few misses, I would say, in this game's boss design. For the most part, the bosses in this game are great, but the big golem I've never been able to get behind. Same thing with the guard armor. They're basically the same fight, which is part of the problem. You fight the same boss 2 times in a row. They don't look the same, obviously, and they have different attacks, but the way you fight them is exactly the same. Here we have the Mandragora. The Mandragora in this game can be a little annoying if you're trying to get the soul from him. Oh, never mind that guy. I'll keep talking about the Mandragora. So, you can defeat the skeleton that's trying to pull the Mandragora out of the ground, and that will kill it. But that does not actually count as killing the Mandragora for the purposes of getting the soul. In order to get the soul, you have to wait until it's pulled out of the ground and kill it then, which means you have to kill it in 1 or 2 hits, because the Mandragora, as soon as it's pulled out of the ground, will very quickly scream and take off a huge chunk of your health bar. So basically, this is a soul you cannot even get until you're well along in the game, to the point where you're doing a lot of DPS. So that can be frustrating. So that was a bit of a curious message. Arikato apparently said, there are enemies in the castle that can stop time, and there are other enemies that are immune to having time stopped on them. Now, that's a bit of a misnomer. There is not actually an enemy in the castle that is immune to having time stopped. It's a soul that you simply find at some point in the game. Not an enemy, just a soul in a jar, like some of the other ones that we found around. And that, in fact, is Galamoth, which is a bonus boss in Symphony of the Night, and also the main villain of the weird, very weird Kid Dracula series on the Game Boy. Once you get the Galamoth soul, which we'll get later, you can in fact get past the enemy that we saw earlier in the inner quarters who could stop time. And if you get his soul, you can actually use it to stop time, which is not very useful at all. It's basically useful for getting another soul of an enemy that moves so fast that you can only see it if you've stopped time. And that soul, if I can remember correctly, does almost nothing. But for an enemy whose soul does do something, and who's actually kind of interesting to fight, we have the Dryads here. I'm a big fan of the Dryads. It's not just that I like the idea of Dryads in general, but also the fact that they generate these little apples and throw them at you, kind of like in Wizard of Oz. But in this case, they actually hurt you. The little sprouts will land on you and suck up your HP like Leech Seed in Pokemon. It's a lot of fun. And here we have a very peaceful and soothing waterfall. It's a lovely sound. One of the few Game Boy Advance sounds that is genuinely nice sounding, since it has such a bit-crushed sound chip. You can try to karate kick into it. It'll do no good. The force of the rushing water is simply too great. But Mina actually told us about this earlier. She said that Arikato said there was a waterfall somewhere where in order to get past, you needed to use a soul that would let you charge through it. We also need to use the Undine Soul in order to be able to stand on the water. If we try to do the rush from inside the doorway, it's too small to actually allow us to turn into the giant Kali. Or Curly, if you believe in this game. This armor that we just picked up is called the Eversing, and it is the best armor in the game. It's absolutely fantastic. For the rest of the game, even though I sometimes have trouble destroying monsters, I don't really have trouble getting killed by them. For the most part, there are a few exceptions. One of the ways in which this game kind of resembles Symphony of the Night is that most enemies might do 1 HP of damage to you, and yet there will be others that can completely take you to pieces. Here we have the Mudman. A funny little enemy. I kind of like him. His soul is pretty bad. Much better, an enemy I like a lot more, is the Were-Jaguar. There's 2 enemies like this in the game. There's a Were-Jaguar and a Were-Tiger, and the fact that they just sort of hustle up to you, with their dukes up, bruising for a fight, they're just funny. I love the way they move. There's a lot of funny moving enemies in this game, and that gives it a lot of charm, I think. Portrait of Ruin did an even better job of that, of enemies who are just silly overall. Part of the reason I said in that earlier video that it's not a scary game, it's just a fun, goofy game. Oh, and here we can open up a doorway. That's a shortcut to another part of the castle. Which you may remember, this is where we found the ancient book that gave us a clue to something. This is inside the study. Now, of course, this isn't actually a very useful shortcut because there's almost no reason to return to the study later in the game. You can get all of the secret hidden stuff here as soon as you have the double jump, which you find in the study. So, really kind of a curious shortcut. I'm not entirely sure why they included it here. I think it was more that at the beginning of the game, when you get the ancient book, they wanted you to have the intrigue of seeing this secret area, and then that would encourage you to go to this portion of the map later on, and maybe serve as a clue that you can get here in the first place. Because for later on in the game, you get almost nothing out of knowing that you can go back to the study from here. I suppose, if you're not, using as cheap tactics as I am, the secret area could cause you to lose a lot of HP, and so it might be nice to be able to go back to the study in order to regain some health. Maybe that's what they were thinking. I forgot I still had the Undine Soul on, so we had a little curious walking on water moment here. Must have confused the heck out of the Dryad. Not that she'll have long to think about it. So yeah, the secret area in this game, there's not a lot to say about it. Honestly, the design of it is a little boring compared with secret areas in some other Castlevanias. I do like this room, though, which has the giant ship that's somehow sunk down here. I don't know where this came from. Did Dracula put it in his castle as a kind of folly? Or did someone actually try to sail a ship into Dracula's castle once and it foundered here? It's a mystery, we'll never really know. But it is moving back and forth, so clearly it is free-floating. It's not just stuck. So, the secret area, normally you'd go around to the right and that would take you to the end. However, there is in fact a secret area inside the secret area, which not everyone will find, but it's right through this fake wall. So in here is a very interesting and unusual weapon. So you can see there, it's something like Climb Solace. In fact, that is not the name, or the way you pronounce that word. This name literally means Sword of Light, and it's basically a plot device that appears in a lot of Irish myth. It's a Celtic word, and like a lot of Celtic words, it has a very strange pronunciation. The word that is spelled C-L-A-I-M-H is actually pronounced cleave. Kind of like a sword cleaving things, which is kind of funny. So the name of it is Cleave Solace. Not Climb Solace, which is what it looks like, or Claim Solace. That's what I've heard a lot of people calling it. I'm going to be calling it the Climb Solace, because that just, it sounds right to me. But yeah, the technical way you pronounce it is Cleave Solace. There's lots of weird words like that in Gaelic, especially in Irish myth. So for instance, there is a figure in Irish legend he was a king. His name is spelled C-O-N-C-H-O-B-A-R. That's his first name, and his last name is MacNessa, which means son of Nessa. There's a lot of matrilineal surnames in Irish myth. So his name looks like it should be pronounced Conchabar. It's actually pronounced Con-Akar. Con-Akar MacNessa. I love Irish myth. It's absolutely crazy. And you see, actually, both in this game and in Dawn of Sorrow. Oh, that's a nasty trick. A chest full of rippers. That's almost worse than a regular mimic. But yeah. Speaking of which, there's a mimic right here. Anyway, the myths in these games are absolutely crazy. So this is the weapon that you would think is the really good weapon you find at the end of this, because it's the obvious one, the Joyeuse. It's a pretty nice sword, but the Cleave Solace is just better. Anyway, I'll see you guys next episode. Have a nice night.